I'm John Rodgers from Cuyahoga Falls, and we're going to be doing one of the shows that I call the Men of Rushmore. It's a series, and we're going to be doing Abraham Lincoln, a lordly cedar. Now, you'll hear that term, a lordly cedar, at the very end. On February the 12th, 1959, the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, Carl Sandburg, the noted Lincoln biographer, addressed a joint session of Congress with these words: "Not often in the story of mankind does a man arrive on earth who is both steel and velvet, who is as hard as rock and soft as drifting fog, who holds in his heart and mind the paradox of terrible storm and peace unspeakable and perfect." He was speaking of a man who quite often was called Father Abraham and was referred to as Honest Abe, a master of expression, written or spoken. Though he became the 16th President of the United States, he retained two important gifts: the common touch and his humor. Now, I've told audiences that you only have two places for laughter in this whole show, and this is one of them, and then there's one towards the end. So to illustrate the common touch and his humor, a visiting ambassador came upon Lincoln polishing his shoes. "Mr. President, do you polish your own shoes?" "Why, certainly, Mr. Ambassador. Whose do you polish?" Okay? All through the long struggle of his life, and especially through the Civil War, he apparently had no hate and certainly harbored no wish for revenge. In this log cabin at Hodgensville, Kentucky, on February the 12th, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born. The log cabin was not unique to the Lincolns, since many families in the area lived in log cabins. And this is the area called Sinking Springs. And from this spring came the first water used by the baby destined to become president. The Boundary Oak was not quite as massive at that time, but it could be seen from the Lincoln cabin. And a sad footnote to this: it has died and has been removed. He lived here at Sinking Springs Farm only about 2 years before the family moved. Lincoln's next home was in the Knob Creek area of Kentucky, about 10 to 12 miles northeast of the birthplace. And this is the type of terrain that is there. This is a reconstruction of the log cabin there. In this area, young Abraham grew to about 7 years of age. Now, his father did not condone slavery, but it was probably farm title problems which prompted the move into southwestern Indiana. The farm was carved out of the wilderness. During these years of growing to manhood, the axe and rail splitting became a part of Lincoln. He and his father cut this road or trace. I would like to tell you that they built that fence, but that fence came along later. But a trace is a road, and they cut this through that area. The farm, the outline of the old cabin, which you're seeing here, and a museum are preserved by the National Park Service. And on this farm, his mother died and is buried. This bust of him is in the museum there at the Indiana farm. At Vincennes, Indiana, Lincoln crossed the Wabash River into Illinois, and this monument is over on the Illinois side at that crossing. He stayed on with the family for another year on the banks of the Sangamon River, this river, just west of Decatur, in a cabin like this reproduction. Then he moved on to New Salem, and he was in New Salem from 1831 to 1837. During these years from Indiana to the Sangamon home to New Salem, one of his jobs was taking a flatboat down to New Orleans. and that's where I have you. This venture was probably his first real experience with slavery, because from this area here, you could probably hear slaves being auctioned. His stay in New Salem was also the time that Anne Rutledge entered his life. The true impact on Lincoln of Anne Rutledge herself and then her early death is really not known, and she's buried here at this marker in Petersburg, Illinois, not far from New Salem. New Salem is a reconstructed village built on the same foundations, building by building. But this one, the Cooper's shop, is an original, the only one. And this was found up by Petersburg, where Anne Rutledge is buried. It was in this shop that Lincoln read By the Light of the Fire. New Salem was the scene of his failure in the shopkeeping business and several other ventures. And here's the statue of him at New Salem with a book on his hip. And here are the Lincoln Berry retail stores. That's the first one. This is the second one. Now remember, these are reconstructions. An ironic note, this statue is at Dixon, Illinois, where Lincoln served in the Black Hawk War. Now, this is not a long period of time, about 6 months he served in that war. It was here that he met Jefferson Davis, later President of the Confederate States, and Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States. But in New Salem, he did win an election, and in 1834 began serving in the Illinois General Assembly in this chamber in the old State House at Vandalia, Illinois. In the years at New Salem, Lincoln studied law, and in that same state house, same old State House at Vandalia, in 1836, he was sworn in to practice law in Illinois. Now, before I show you the Chief Justice chambers, this is one of the Madonna of the Trail statues that you will find along the old National Road, US 40, and that is the State House in the background. The Illinois Chief Justice administered the oath for Lincoln to practice law in Illinois in this room. Now, during the time after that oath and extending into his Springfield days, Lincoln rode the law circuit. The Logan County Courthouse, found now in Greenfield Village, Michigan, was one of his stopping places. This New Salem statue of Lincoln riding and reading depicts that part of his life. Another courtroom house where Lincoln stopped while riding the circuit can still be found today at Beardstown in western Illinois. It's said to be the only courthouse used by Lincoln and still used for trials twice weekly in the upper floor of that building. The lower floor is the police department. This courtroom was the scene of a murder trial, the Almanac trial, or Duff Armstrong trial, in which Lincoln won acquittal for his client. He used the Almanac to prove that the prime prosecution witness could not have identified his client by full moonlight, since the moon had set hours before the alleged identification. And this painting depicts him using that almanac. In 1837, Lincoln moved to Springfield and continued to serve in the state legislature in this chamber, in what is now considered the old State House. The capital had just been moved from Vandalia to Springfield, and this is the one downtown. And his law office is on the corner just across from that State House. The law office is on the top floor, and a courtroom is on the second floor. In this room, Lincoln prepared hundreds of cases. He was a busy and a good lawyer in this room here. Many of those cases were tried in the same building on the second floor in this courtroom. Now, to keep the record straight, this is the State House in use today, and that is the statue of Lincoln in front of it. A footnote to history: the square at the old State House in downtown Springfield was a point of assembling for the doomed Donner Party in 1846. They're the ones that got trapped in the Sierra Nevadas by snow, and many of them died. Lincoln married Mary Todd in 1842, and 2 years later they moved into this Springfield neighborhood, into this home. The whole area is now part of the National Park system. In 1846, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, and so he left Springfield for Washington. His opposition to the Mexican War promised defeat for re-election, and so he chose not to stand for re-election. Isn't that sort of nice? He chose not to stand, not to run for re-election, but not to stand for re-election. I wish they'd go back to that. Lincoln experienced several more election defeats and more than his share of hard experiences. But his words dug deep into the heart of a situation or issue, and he was becoming known in places besides just little Illinois. In 1858, at a Republican state convention in the legislative chamber, which you're looking at in the old State House, Lincoln used these words: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." And this is the in the upper floor looking, and it's the same chamber. Later in Ottawa, Illinois, the Lincoln-Douglas debates began in a race for the Senate. And this is at Ottawa, and these statues are quite new. Is Lincoln on the left and Douglas on the right. And this was the location, Ottawa, Illinois, of the first of 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates. And here at Knox College at Old Main in Galesburg, Illinois, the 5th and most famous of the debates occurred. Lincoln's stirring words were, he is blowing out the moral lights around us when he contends that whoever wants slaves has a right to hold them. He lost that race also, and that 5th debate was right on these steps. And the plaque on the left is the one to Lincoln, and the one on the right was to Douglas. Lincoln was by now, even with various failures, moving towards the presidency. In an address in February 1860 at Cooper's Union in New York City, which you're looking at, let us have faith that right makes might. And candidate Lincoln attracted quite a crowd in front of his Springfield home. Remember, we had photography. Now, this map will help you locate several of the important places in Lincoln's life. Down here in Kentucky, the birthplace, and just very close by, where he lived to about 8 years of age in the Knob Creek area. And then this is the farm in southwestern Indiana, where he then grew to manhood. This is at Vincennes, where he first crossed the river into the Wabash River into Illinois. Now, we'll come back to this one in a moment. And he went up then, he lived with the family for a while up at Decatur. I don't have that mark. But this is New Salem up here. And then this is Vandalia, where he first served in the assembly in the old State House. And this is Springfield. The old State House here is downtown, and the new one is out on the west. And this is Galesburg, Illinois, where the 5th of the Lincoln-Douglas debates took. And incidentally, Carl Sandburg, the great biographer of Lincoln, was born and is buried there in Galesburg as well. And finally, from the interwoven threads of politics, Lincoln emerged as the new president, the 16th of the United States. Just before leaving for Washington, he received well wishes in this room in the old state capitol. Then, after an emotional farewell, he departed from Springfield at this little railroad station to assume office. The most notable words of his inaugural journey were spoken at the State House in Columbus, Ohio, in this legislative chamber. I look to the American people and to that God who has never forsaken them. There has fallen on me a task such as did not rest even upon the father of his country. And as I mentioned, those words were spoken inside the Capitol in the legislative chamber. And then these words were spoken on the steps outside to a crowd that had gathered. It is not much for me, for I shall very soon pass away from you. But affection for the Union is of immense value to you and your posterity forever. Now, the dome of the Capitol in Washington was still unfinished when he gave his first inaugural address. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bond of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. And at the very end, March 4th, 1861, first inaugural address, the very end, he gave this warning to the South. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is a momentous issue of civil war. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. And this is a photograph of the first inauguration. And here is Lincoln on Mount Rushmore. Now, by the time those words were spoken, South Carolina had long since seceded from the Union. That happened in December 1860. Actually, a first shot had been fired on January the 9th, 1861, on the ship Star of the West, which was trying to supply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And if you look through the sea oats, you can see Fort Sumter. This firing took place on this sandy point of land where I'm standing taking the picture, Cummings Point on the end of Morris Island, by cadets from the Citadel in Charleston. And they turned back the Star of the West, and it did not supply the fort at that time. Then the war really began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter by Southern forces on April the 12th, 1861. And it happened, they're not quite sure, but within a quarter of a mile of this monument at Fort Johnson on James Island, across from Charleston. The end was 4 long years away. And in those years, and these are some of the guns, that is Fort Sumter, and here are some of the guns inside Fort Sumter. So the end was 4 long years away. And in those years, and in the years preceding the war, both North and South had forces of division at work. H.G. Wells, An Outline of History, says this of Lincoln's position. These guns are at Manassas, the next ones will be at Shiloh, and then the next ones will be at Gettysburg. And this is what H.G. Wells said. But for Lincoln, there was no doubt. He was a clear-minded man in the midst of such confusion. He stood for the Union. He stood for the great peace of America. He was opposed to slavery, but slavery he held to be a secondary issue. My quote, he didn't always hold it to be a secondary issue. His primary purpose was that the United States should not be torn into 2 contrasting and jarring fragments. So through the long 4 years of struggle, he stood out, an inflexible conviction. a steadfast will. Burnside Bridge at Antietam was the scene of the worst battle in terms of casualties in a day of any war, except the dropping of the atomic bombs. And this little stream, this beautiful stream, actually ran red with blood. And this is a painting of what they think that battle was like at Burnside Bridge. The net result was a slight Union victory, and Lincoln used it along with his wartime powers on September the 17th, 1862, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This is Bloody Lane there at Antietam, and along Bloody Lane they say that you would have to really watch to step on ground instead of bodies along there. And here were some of the bodies of Bloody Lane. Now, the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, set free only the slaves in the states of rebellion. This is the late Henry Ladson, Brooks we call him. He couldn't read or write, but he could work, and I have worked with Brooks. His ancestors were slaves. The lives of Brooks's ancestors were governed by people not of their own choosing. Their names were found on documents like these, bills of sales and promissory notes, not on birth certificates like yours and mine. Here's a close-up. Read, for you and I can read. And this is a bill of sale on a Negro woman named Mary and her two children, Henry and Amanda, Warranted Sound. And quite often, if a woman was named, it also said, and future deliveries, or something of that nature, to indicate that all of her children would be born into slavery. This medal, with its number, hung around the neck of a person, and together with the appropriate paper, it enslaved him or her. This Southern newspaper came out very near the end of the war. You're looking at the front page, and there are ads on there for runaway slaves and for the auctioning of slaves. And there's one on there for the return of a cattle or a mule. There had been many battles, and the costs on both sides were staggering, but the war ground on. Lincoln, in a message to Congress in December 1862, said, "In times like the present, men should utter nothing for which they would not willingly be responsible through time and in eternity." And further on, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on July the 1st through 3rd, 1863, the Confederacy reached the high water mark of the war, the northernmost penetration. And this is from the great cyclorama at Gettysburg. In the wheat fields out here, held by Union forces, the fighting was intense, as it was in the peach orchard. And the last time I was there, it was still in peaches. From down in positions in Devil's Den, and that is down in here, Confederate sharpshooters picked off Union soldiers on Little Round Top, where I am standing. And here is Little Round Top. Today, on Seminary Ridge, the Confederate cannons are silent. But once they fired towards the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge. This North Carolina monument by Borglum, that's the same Borglum that carved Mount Rushmore, is an indication of the tension in the moments before and during Pickett's charge across this field towards Cemetery Ridge. And this is Cemetery Ridge up here. And they were going, the point was this copse of trees here. Confederate losses were extremely heavy, and then the Southern tide retreated southward. 15,000 had charged shoulder to shoulder in a line 1.5 miles across, and only 50 minutes later, only 5,000 were left to retreat southward. When Lincoln came on November the 18th, 1863, the sound of battle, though raging elsewhere, was gone from the Gettysburg battlefield. This is the cemetery where his address was delivered, and it was delivered right where that monument is. And I'll go on over to the commemorative statue of Lincoln. It's back here, and we will move one more time to it. That's the commemorative statue. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. Further on, that we hear highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. No reference was made to Union or Confederacy, simply brave men. Many battles were still in the future. Many more would breathe their last in battle on the soil of their own land. There's Grant and his staff. Later on the White House lawn, I shall do nothing through malice. What I deal with is too vast for malice. And from the second inaugural address in 1865, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations. Here in the McLean House at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April the 9th, 1865, that was Palm Sunday, Grant and Lee agreed to terms, and the surrender documents were signed. Grant and Lee had one last meeting on horseback, and then they left Appomattox Courthouse. Close by are the surrender grounds. The Union forces drew up on the left, and this little road we're talking about, the Union forces came in from here, and then on the other side, the Confederates came up on the right and laid down their arms, and the surrender took many, many hours. Now, what had happened? There was a land of cavaliers and ladies called the Old South, a land of cotton plantations and magnolias, a time of elegance and aristocracy. Look for it now only in books, for it is a dream only dimly remembered, a moment of time that has gone with the wind. That's a quote. Only a few hundred yards from the McLean House is this small cemetery, which contains 18 Confederate soldiers, and on the far end, one Union soldier. Francis Miles French wrote a poem, The Blue and the Gray, which is appropriate. These in the robings of glory, those in the gloom of defeat, all with the battle blood gory in the dust of eternity meet, under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the laurel, the blue, under the willow, the gray. At Chattanooga, Civil War dead lie on a knoll by the flag. And at Arlington National Cemetery, this tomb of 478 unknown dead of the Civil War is overshadowed by the pomp of the unknown soldiers' graves of World War I and World War II. Union forces paraded on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington to celebrate the end of the war. The Union was badly torn, but it was preserved. The guns and the battle cries were stilled. The grass and other elements of nature began to cover the physical scars. People tried to pick up the pieces and find their way. A difficult task anywhere in the country, but especially so in the South. Quiet reigned. And this is a view from my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. But while Abraham Lincoln was sitting in this chair, less than a week after the surrender, one more shot was fired. In the words of Walt Whitman, "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. Oh, Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills." My Captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arms. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my Captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Abraham Lincoln was shot on April the 14th, 1865, Good Friday, and he died the next day. A special train took his body back home to Springfield, Illinois. Carved models of one of the locomotives and the train are at the Waltham Museum in Dover, Ohio. The next to the last car contains the miniature coffin. And this picture of the Lincoln funeral procession passing Union Square in New York City is a historic connection to the future. Up in this room here, see it up here, one of those children is Theodore Roosevelt, and this is the home of his grandfather. A sustained outpouring of grief accompanied the train, and this is the monument marking his grave, a reminder of battle on each corner, an unfitting tribute to such a man. Here's one of those battle scenes. But there is a good statue of him, and that's the one you saw from a distance. And inside, this is the tomb. And this is a copy of the last known photograph of Abraham Lincoln. And it has a crack across the top. Now, I told you there was one more bit of humor. Lincoln, being a man of humor, would probably appreciate these two pictures. This is at Mount Rushmore, and he would have to get over the shock of being depicted on Mount Rushmore. But a ranger has been lured in a bosun's chair to examine the faces for cracks. Here he is here. And they do this every, I think always in September. That's when I took these pictures. And they're trying to see what cracks have to be patched before those awful South Dakota winters make it even worse. And here is that same guy in the bosun's chair sitting on Lincoln's nose, and I'll bet if Lincoln was here, he'd slap his thigh and have a good laugh over that guy sitting on his nose. And this footnote seems appropriate. Stephen Douglas, who was Lincoln's opponent in those famous debates and who defeated him in that race, became one of Lincoln's staunchest supporters. And this statue of Douglas is on the grounds of the present State House. In refusing to participate in a drive for a monument for a friend, Lincoln once said, "Let him have the marble monument, along with the more enduring one in the hearts of those who love liberty unselfishly for all men." Yet all over this country and in other lands, the likeness of Abraham Lincoln stands as a monument in small-town parks, on the magnificent Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And that one was done by Daniel Chester French. This one is a little dark. This is in Oslo in Norway, in a park there. And this one is in London, very close to a statue of Sir Winston Churchill. And then along Princes Street in a little cemetery in Edinburgh, Scotland, is this statue of Lincoln. And now you're going to see various monuments to Lincoln, including a painting by Eisenhower, a wood carving in Summit County, and the 3 statues in foreign lands I have now shown you, and ending with a statue within the Lincoln Memorial. And I'll be reading Edward Markham's poem, Lincoln, the Man of the People, which he read when the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in 1922. And this is in the Garfield home up in Lake County. When the Norn mother saw the whirlwind hour greatening and darkening as it hurried on, she left the heaven of heroes and came down to make a man to meet the mortal need. She took the tried clay of the common road, clay warm yet with the genial heat of earth, dashed through it all a strain of prophecy, tempered the heap with thrill of human tears, then mixed her laughter with the serious stuff. Into the shape she breathed a flame to light that tender, tragic, ever-changing face, and laid on him a sense of the mystic powers, moving all hushed behind the mortal veil. Here was a man to hold against the world, a man to match the mountains and the sea. The color of the ground was in him, the red earth, the smack and tang of elemental things, the rectitude and patience of the cliff, the goodwill of the rain that loves all leaves, the friendly welcome of the wayside well, the courage of the bird that dares the sea, the gladness of the wind that shakes the corn, the pity of the snow that hides all scars, the secrecy of streams that make their way under the mountain to the rifted rock. This is the portrait by Eisenhower. The tolerance and equity of light that gives as freely to the shrinking flower as to the great oak flaring to the wind, to the grave's low hill as to the Matterhorn that shoulders out the sky. Sprung from the west, he drank the valorous youth of a new world. The strength of virgin forest braced his mind. The hush of spacious prairie stilled his soul. His words were oaks and acorns, and his thoughts were roots that firmly gripped the granite truth. Up from log cabin to the Capitol, one fire was on his spirit, one resolve to send the keen axe to the root of wrong, clearing a free way for the feet of God, the eyes of conscience testing every stroke to make his deed the measure of a man. He built the rail pile as he built the state, pouring his splendid strength through every blow. The grip that swung the axe in Illinois was on the pen that set a people free. So came the captain with the mighty heart, and when the judgment thunder split the house, wrenching the rafters from their ancient rest, he held the ridgepole up and spiked again the rafters of the home. He held his place, held a long purpose like a growing tree, held on through blame and faltered not at praise. And when he fell in whirlwind, he went down as when a lordly cedar green with boughs goes down with a great shout upon the hills and leaves a lonesome place against the sky. Consider Abraham Lincoln's humble beginnings, his time at New Salem and Springfield, and all of his misfortunes, political and otherwise. Then follow that with thoughts of what he was as President of the United States, with a terrible civil war raging around him. Think deeply about what he did for our country, and you must conclude that this was a great man.